Hey Ria.
Hi.
What time do you want to go ahead and get started? Should we maybe start in like a couple minutes?
Yeah, yeah, I can wait a few minutes.
Okay. Do you want me to do the screen sharing or do you want to do it?
Do you want a screen share? Would that be?
Yeah. Yeah, okay, well, maybe we can go ahead and get started. There might be some people like trickling in a little bit later, but we can just go ahead and get started with like our introductions and things like that. Um, so yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this like Friday afternoon. If you guys have been to some of the seminars last semester, you may remember me. My name is Fatuma Runderconnect, and I'm a second year medical student with the JMP and one of the founders of White Coats for Black Lives at Berkeley. And I'm joined here by Ria, who can also introduce herself in a moment. And so today we're going to be going over our seminar on the AMCAS, specifically the activities section. Yep, so these are some of the other leadership members of the White Coats team. And then Ria, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm a first year medical student in the joint medical program and a member of White Coats for Black Lives. And I also organize with the Stop San Quentin Outbreak Coalition. And happy to be here and facilitate this session with you all.
Yeah. And then Ria, also, if people do have questions and they want to put them in the chat, they can. And maybe since I'm screen sharing, you can moderate the chat, Ria. Yeah, and then we also wanted to give a shout out to our public relations fellow, Semhar, who's a senior at UC Berkeley. We'll talk about this at the end of our presentation, but we're also having an opportunity for an undergrad or post-bac who's part of our White Coats for Black Lives Fellowship to be an intern for the public relations sector of White Coats. So there will be a little flyer about that at the end of our session. Yeah, and I can just quickly go over the goals of White Coats. White Coats aims to strengthen pathway connections across the lengthy pre-medical preparation and medical school application timeline for students who are underrepresented in medicine. And to achieve this goal, we plan to host a series of events focused on supporting URM pre-medical students at UC Berkeley and beyond. We have in our White Coats for Black Lives mentorship cohort students from all across the US. We're specifically focused on students at Berkeley, but again, we really want to make sure that we are providing resources and support for underrepresented students in medicine. And the White Coats chapter at Berkeley was started by all med students who are also underrepresented in medicine and would love to have these sorts of resources when we were applying to med school. Yeah, so this is a little preview of our seminar series for this semester. So today we have the AMCAS activity session. In a couple weeks, we're going to have non-traditional pathways and belonging, and that's going to be led by some of our White Coats for Black Lives leadership members who didn't take traditional pathways to medical school, took a lot of years off, and they can talk a little bit more about their journey to medicine. On April 6th, there's going to be a seminar on AMCAS application process. So the AMCAS will be opening up in May, so May 1st, I believe. So that will be a great time to kind of go over it before it opens up. April 9th, we're having a guest seminar by Michael Schollenbeck, who's the public health librarian at UC Berkeley. This will be a really great opportunity for anyone who's interested in doing any sort of like public health literature research. And I'm going to talk about a little bit later today how that can be really helpful for your application. And so I would really recommend going to this session if you can. And then we're also going to have a personal statement workshop on May 3rd. And I believe on May 1st, we don't have the details ironed out yet, but we're going to have a half-day conference. So especially those in the mentorship cohort, look out for a announcement on that. Okay, so to quickly go over our agenda, we just had the introduction. And welcome everyone who's kind of trickled in a little bit later. We're going to do some example activity write-ups. We'll talk about AMCAS requirements, what counts as an activity. Both Ria and I are going to share some of our activity write-ups that we did for the AMCAS. I'll talk a little bit about how to engage in extracurricular activities during COVID and some, creative ways that you can still create activities and meaningful events for yourself, even given the COVID restrictions. And then we'll open it up with questions. So Ria, maybe you can take it from here.
Yeah, we wanted to start off today with a session to give some space for you all to free write. The prompt that we want you to think about is write about one of your most important extracurricular activities, or another way to think about that is just a way that you spend your time. In this free write, to think about what you accomplished in this activity. What does the activity show about your character, and how will this activity help you become a doctor? These are just guiding questions, and we want to help you, just provide some space for you to have some time to write. We'll take about 7 or 8 minutes, and then come back together and talk more specifically about the AMCAS prompt.
Great, so I'm gonna go ahead and set the timer now. And yeah, if you guys just wanna take some time to follow the instructions Ria gave you. Um, I noticed some new people have joined. So for those who joined, we're taking a couple minutes to do a activity summary. So write about one activity that you've done. Okay, I think we can wrap it up and move on to the next slide, Ria.
Yeah, I wanted to invite people that were able to do the free write. If you could just put a word in the chat of how it felt to do that writing. Invitation to just share. Um, how did that feel for you? And we can go to the next slide. Yeah, keep adding how that felt, and we'll come back to some of those feelings in a bit. So I appreciate folks for sharing. This is what the AMCAS prompt will be for you when you're writing your extracurricular activities for the application. So think about the work experience, extracurricular activities, awards, honors, or publication that you would like to bring to the attention of your medical schools. And you have you can share a maximum of 15 experiences. And for 3 of those, you can also have an additional writing room to share why those experiences were particularly transformative, what impact you made while engaging in those activities, and the personal growth you experienced. And I'll just share a link to AMCAS in the chat for the work and activity section. And another consideration is to think about how your experiences fit into the AMCAS core competencies as a reference, if that's helpful for you to also guide your writing. And we can go to the next slide. So now we wanted to share some examples of what we each wrote for our activity section. So we'll start with mine, and I'll just give you all a little bit of time to read this. This is not as an example of like a perfect response. There is no perfect response, but more so for you to get a sense of how you could write, what's an example, and yeah, just more so a sense of that. And welcome any questions in the chat too as you're reading this, or if any thoughts come up. And we can go to the next slide. So I chose that experience as one of the ones that I wrote about for the most meaningful summary. And this was an internship that facilitated through a class that I took at Berkeley called Field Studies in Community and Labor Organizing. And I think in terms of time, there were like other activities that I might have spent more time on, but the reason that this felt more significant to me and more meaningful was were the people that I got to interact with through those organizing experiences. So when you're deciding what to choose for most meaningful, it doesn't have to be what you spent the most time on, but really thinking about what's made the greatest impact on you, and what's been most salient for your experience and in defining your purpose so far. Um,
I have a question.
mhm.
So okay, so just like seeing your example, Ria, so when we're just listing the activities, is that more so kind of like what we would list on our resume? But then if we did choose, let's say one of our activities as a most meaningful, to do a like most meaningful summary on, that would be more like the significance to us then?
Yeah. So the way I interpreted the prompts when I submitted my application was the most meaningful summary is for you to expand more on is to reflect more on the experience, and the shorter one you have like 700 characters, so it's hard to have as much reflection in those. And that's I ended up naming more just like what I did in the work, and at the end still connecting it to why it connects to the reason for going into medicine and how it had a personal impact on me. But you just have less room to do that when for the like maximum of 15 activities. Fatuma, did you have thoughts on that too?
No, I think that you did a great summary of it, and we'll also go over my most meaningful and just a summary of some of the 15 activities. And you can see it's very similar to what Ria did in that with the 700 characters, you really just are able to explain what your responsibilities were and what you did. Whereas in the meaningful, you can reflect a bit about it. You could connect it to why you think it made you want to go into medicine or why you think it makes you well equipped to go into medicine. So there's a lot of different ways that you can reflect on it, but it just adds another layer to really show why it is meaningful to you.
And there was another question in the chat. Can you combine multiple experiences that are similar into one most meaningful entry? So you can, if you combine those multiple experiences as one entry for like one of the 15 activities, then you would be able to combine that in a meaningful summary just in the way that the application is set up. And then for your decision for whether you want to combine it or keep them as separate is really just how much you want to talk about those experiences, and whether it makes more sense for you to combine. But yeah, I think there's you can do either as it makes sense for you.
And I can add on to this a little too. I would be a little bit careful about trying to fit in so many things into these even the most meaningful one, it's still really, really short. I think with all of the activity write-ups, it's really about quality rather than quantity. So you don't want to just say, oh, I've done all these things, but you want to focus more on things that were important to you and important to your journey to medicine. So I can give a personal example in not my most meaningful summary, but one of my activities, I just put tutoring because I had tutored with a number of different organizations, and that was a really important experience for me. And I felt like it was easy to clump them all together because they were all kind of the same thing. But of course, that wasn't my most meaningful one. It was just one of my activities that I felt like it could easily go together. So of course, it depends on the person, but you want to make sure you're giving yourself room to explain why things are important to you, especially in the most meaningful summary portion.
And there was another question of, do you have to have a letter recommendation for each most meaningful activity? So I don't think that's a requirement. And yeah, I don't think schools will be tracking that, or you don't have to worry about that. And I had a couple other thoughts to share for the reflection before we move to Fatuma's examples. So going back to some of the emotions that you all mentioned, that this like writing that brought up for you, it felt awkward, insightful, helpful, nostalgic, stream of consciousness, reflective, and difficult to summarize. So I want to recognize that this is also writing about our experiences in our lives is a vulnerable and difficult process. And it's an opportunity to share about your authentic self. And we are also so much more than what we end up writing on these applications. And I want to remind us all of that, because the application process can make us fixate on evaluating ourselves. And that's also can be harmful to our relationship to ourselves. So when you're in the process of writing your activities or your personal statement, other aspects of the application, be intentional to take care of yourself. And what rituals could you create to affirm yourself after you spend some time writing? And other questions that I just want to share is how you can practice gratitude in the process and center your purpose. The application shouldn't take us away from our purpose, but instead be an opportunity to share our journey. Yeah, so just want to name the emotional impact that this can also have. And I also saw lots of questions in the chat, so maybe we should take some time to talk about those. How long should you be engaged in an activity before you can claim it is your most meaningful? Fatima, do you want to take that? Or?
Yeah, there's no hard and fast rules to any of these. I think a most meaningful activity should be one that you feel really paved, your path to medicine and had a big impact on your life. And I think that that's really the only criteria I would ascribe to it. You don't have to say that I was in it for 4 years or 3 years. It doesn't matter. Obviously, whatever it is that you choose, it should be something that you have spent significant time on. I think I was going to give this example later, but perhaps you coordinated a conference or something, and maybe that conference was only a day long, but if you spent months and months preparing for it, then that still counts as the most meaningful activity if it was most meaningful to you. So I wouldn't try to think of things quantitatively and oh, I need to be in something for this amount of time. It's just what was most important to you and what makes most sense with your journey.
And another question was, what if you've had multiple positions in one organization? Is that something you can split into different activities? I think I ended up doing this in my application, and I can't remember for which activity. But it helps you, especially if you've dedicated a lot of time to one activity, but you've held multiple roles in it. It can be helpful to split it up so you have more time to share your reflections and the ways in which it's had impact on you. So yeah, I think that's totally okay. Anything else you wanted to add? And then another question is shadowing or clinical hours considered an activity, or is there another section for that on the application?
Yeah, that would be considered an activity. To my understanding, there's not another section. Some schools may ask you specifically about that, but yeah, that would be something you would put on your activities section.
And then another question is, if you engaged in an activity only during the summer, but for consecutive years, how do you calculate your hours per week? I can't remember now the specific ways that you input activities, but I think it might ask you for I don't know. I guess I would estimate hours per week as what it was over summer. And then your description, I'm guessing, would indicate that it was just for summer, and maybe that would and that should help clarify. For the time frame, does it just give you one option to indicate a time frame?
I don't really remember exactly, but I think you can also average things. I think you can explain it in your description if necessary, but again, if they don't give you the option to put for specific times, I would just probably average it.
And someone also added in the chat, I don't think they have hours per week anymore. It's just total hours now. So that would help simplify that. And with that, I think we can go to the other example.
Oh, I had a question really fast. Was it hard for y'all to kind of think about the total hours that you've done for each activity? Because I don't know, some of these activities I've just done for multiple years, so I don't know exactly how many, it's just a lot. So yeah, so I just don't know how many hours total.
Yeah, I think it's an estimation personally. For a lot of these things, unless you're logging hours, which for most things you do, you're probably not. You won't know an exact number, so I would just guess to the best of your ability, and I would definitely not stress over it at all. did you want to add anything, Ria?
No, I think that was good. I think I tried to think about it as like by week, how many hours, but really we just have to do our best.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to give you guys an example of both my activity and a most meaningful activity. In this case, I put two different ones so you could kind of see the differences in terms of how I talk about a most meaningful one versus one of the 15 activities. Yeah, so I can just read these out loud. The Harvard IOP invites fellows each semester to host weekly seminars. I was a student liaison for Peter Staley's study group and was in charge of publicizing and coordinating weekly meetings. Staley is an AIDS activist who is influential in the organization ACT UP. This was an amazing experience for me because I learned how to merge my interest in public health and social justice and be a better health activist. I got to speak with doctors like Dr. Deborah Birx and Dr. Tony Fauci, who helped me understand how to promote health equity as a physician. Learning about the impact of activism motivated me to do my part in helping to reduce health inequity and start my blog Healing Points. And in the next section with my most meaningful activity, I talk a little bit about my blog. So just to quickly summarize this, essentially, I explain what the activity is, I explain what my role or responsibility within the activity was, and I explained kind of very quickly in a sentence or two what impact that activity had on me. And so again, because you guys are given such little room to really explain these, it's good to kind of have a formula, an idea of what it is you need to include in those. And I think that that's like a pretty good way to go. In some instances, maybe you have so many responsibilities that you won't have a chance to explain the impact it had on you, or also potentially you can talk about any changes or accomplishments that you've made in the organization or whatever it is in your research, and that would go kind of towards the end as well. So we can go to the next slide. And so as you can see, this is the most meaningful one. It's a little bit longer, and I can read it out again and then review it. So starting my blog Healing Points was very important to me as I began to think about what I want to accomplish in my career as a physician. As a Black woman and child of immigrants, I am deeply disturbed by racial inequities in healthcare, and it is imperative to me that I improve the health status of underserved communities and communities of color. While I will have more capacity to improve the health status of communities as a physician, I wanted to use the skills and resources that were currently available to me to begin making a difference. Writing and editing pieces for the blog has taught me much about social justice issues in healthcare and has given me a better sense of the role that physicians have in promoting health advocacy and reducing inequities in healthcare. Starting and managing my own blog has also provided me with useful skills like multitasking, leading a team, and learning how to write and edit concisely. As the co-founder and editor-in-chief, I manage the website, edit pieces for a team of over 10 contributors, as well as write and research my own articles. Working on Healing Points, I've garnered practical skills along with the knowledge and awareness that will allow me to be a socially conscious and action-driven physician. So again, to summarize this, it was also included in one of my activity summaries. So in that space, I used a little bit of time to talk about what Healing Points was. And so that's not necessarily reflected here in the most meaningful section. But I was able to explain what motivated me to start this blog. And so that's what I wrote about in the beginning and talked a little bit about my background and why this was something I was interested in. I was able to talk about the skills that I gained and the leadership capabilities I gained. It's really important, this is a side note, but to a bit quantify things sometimes. So as I say, I managed a team of over 10 contributors, and sometimes including those quantifiers is really helpful to give people a sense of okay, maybe you led a team of 10 people versus leading a team of 60 people or whatever. It shows it shows exactly what you were doing and gives them a better sense of what you learned from your activity. Yeah, and I talk a little bit too about just generally what impact I kind of hope to have in the future, and I'm able to mesh that in to my most meaningful summary. So before we move on, does anybody have any questions on the summaries on my end? I know you guys were already able to ask a lot of those questions when we went over Ria's. And I'm not monitoring the chat, so.
There was a question during the medical school interviews where you asked to elaborate on your most meaningful activity, especially since there's a character limit.
No, I don't remember being asked that specifically. A lot of medical school interviews, they will talk, just ask you to tell about yourself, and then you can talk about your most meaningful activities or talk about whatever it is that's important to you in that case. A lot of medical school interviews are closed applications. That means they haven't read your application beforehand, and they'll let you know if they haven't read it. So in that case, again, they won't even have read these at all. It's a completely different experience, and it's again up to you to kind of decide what it is that you want to talk about. So for the most part, I think of the applications and the interviews as kind of two separate processes. And in the interviews, it's really up to you to say it is what you want to say about yourself. And then they will ask you questions based off of what it is that you talk about. Any other questions? Okay, we can move on.
No.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about my activities that I did, and I guess how you can talk about and create kind of a narrative for yourself that's cohesive. So essentially, in high school, college, and my gap years prior to going to medical school, I did a number of different activities, and I felt that they kind of all built on top of each other because it's important to help find some sort of thread that pulls things together. And I think that once you start thinking about all the things that you've done and all the things that you spent your time on, it usually does become clear to people what is their motivating thread or what's the theme there. So as you guys kind of got a little bit of a sneak peek in my activity descriptions, my interest in healthcare and eventually becoming a physician has always been my personal family background. Being a Black woman and coming from a family of immigrants, seeing health disparities firsthand, and doing different things along my path to try and work to alleviate health disparities. So in high school, that's probably where I first started to become interested in the health field and in the science field, and slightly didn't have as much of a clear picture in terms of wanting to work in health disparities specifically, because I didn't really know what that was, although I had experienced it. So I, did a little bit of research in high school. I worked with some immigrant communities where I lived as a teaching aide and taught English and math, and also started a club focused on medicine and biotechnology. And so these were kind of some formative activities I did once I started to figure out what my interests were. Once I got to college, there were so many more opportunities for me to get involved in things that I was interested in. So I worked at organizations like Peer Health Exchange. This is an organization where college volunteers go into under-resourced high schools to teach about health education. And again, for me, coming from my background, I felt that health literacy was so important. So this was a really amazing opportunity for me. Plus, I've done a lot of work in terms of teaching and tutoring, so that kind of meshed both of my interests. I also worked with the Cambridge Health Alliance, and I worked as a a resource specialist in low-income community clinics. And so that work, I was able to connect people with resources. I started my blog, Healing Points, which I talked about a little bit. And so these things all kind of focus on the main theme that of my interest in health disparities, and I made sure to make that evident in my application. In my gap years, I continued to work on my blog. I worked at a clinic in San Francisco called Clinic by the Bay, and now that I'm in medical school, I've continued to work on this trajectory by co-founding White Coats and doing the work that we're doing now. So I would invite you guys, when you're starting to think about what activities you want to talk about and starting to think about your application as a whole, to think about how it is you want to present yourself and how you want to talk about your own personal narrative. So in doing these, it's helpful to look for themes and look for, why do I want to become a physician? What have I done to get to the place that I am now? How do these things connect to each other? And I think that when you do reflect on that, those things will become fairly clear to you. Okay, let's do this slide next. And then after that, we can have some questions before we move on to our last section, which will cover how you can be creative during COVID times in terms of doing new activities. Some myths that I want to bust are, extracurriculars aren't as important as my grades and scores. And obviously, it's very important that you have good grades and good scores, but unfortunately, medical school is very competitive, and most people applying, will have competitive grades and scores. And extracurriculars allow you to set yourself apart from other people and to show what's unique and special about you. And also, they are wonderful experiences that really do help you become a doctor. So again, if someone is to read your application and they see that you aren't really involved in anything, that's not going to catch someone's eye as much as if there are things that you are passionate about and that you can talk about. So other myths are that you have to do wet lab or other research. Research can be very helpful. That being said, there's so many types of ways to do research, and all those things are valuable, and all of those things can help you learn how to think critically and how to create a project and how to form hypotheses and etc. And it doesn't mean that you have to pipette in a wet lab if that's not what your passion is. So I think that's something that as a pre-med, I thought I had to do wet lab research. That's not my personal interest or passion. And so I don't want other pre-meds to feel that they have to do that.
Oh, sorry. I had a question.
Yeah. Okay. Is it okay if I just go through these and then we can save questions for the slide? Okay,
yes.
Awesome. Yeah, so other myths, like all of your extracurriculars have to be associated with health. That's not true. I think Ria did a really amazing job of highlighting some of her really meaningful activities. And as you can see, those weren't necessarily directly related to health, but they show what Ria's passions are and how she works with communities. And so everything doesn't have to be health related. And it's great to do things that you're passionate about. And, during your interviews and in your applications, those passions will really show through. Lastly, activism and community organizing don't count as extracurriculars, or they are not as important as other extracurriculars. Again, those things are very important and can help you so much as a doctor in being able to work with communities that you want to work with. And as you saw in both mine and Ria's most meaningful activities, we talked about things that have to do with activism, social justice, community organizing, and we didn't talk about wet lab research or whatever. And if you do wet lab research and you love it, that's so awesome. And then you should definitely talk about it. I just want to show that that's not the only thing that people can do. Yeah. And again, all pre-meds don't need to do the same thing. What's important is that you're passionate and committed to things, and that will show through. So before we move on to the COVID portion, it seems like there's some questions and I'm happy to answer them.
So one question was, if we had a really meaningful experience in high school, can we mention it in our application, or should we mostly focus on college activities?
Again, I think it's super dependent um, on what on the person, but I would probably not. That's just me speaking personally, and I'm not the end all, be all of applications, but I think it's important to talk about things that are perhaps more recent. So if there's something that you did in high school or an experience you had that perhaps you've built upon since then, that would be definitely something worth talking about. But if it's something that happened in high school and kind of stayed in high school and you haven't worked on it since, I probably wouldn't. So yeah, like if you did, I don't know, research in high school and then in college you continue to do different types of research, maybe that would be um, a good thing. But they want to see consistency, and so if it's not something you've done since then, I would probably say no. Ria, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I agree with what you said, and the my only other thought is there might be another place in your application to share that, in your personal statement, in specific prompts for in your secondaries, um, to show a progression of like how of to share the impact and meaningfulness of that experience for you. But for the activities, I think also mentioning more recent experiences would be better. And then another question is, in activity descriptions, do they ask for the years when it began and ended? Is there if there's a gap in the time frame, can you indicate that? I again can't remember the specifics of how I entered in the activities. Um, but I think that was asked in the application when activities started and ended. Um, and yeah, I also don't think, like, do your best to fit your experiences into the parameters that they ask you, but it's not something you'll be evaluated on, and it's not something you have to show receipts for either. Um, so yeah, if that helps reduce the anxiety around like how to input all those activities, just do the best that you can. Um, and then yeah, there were also questions of if there's going to be a recording and if we'll share the slides. So we will share the recording and slides both afterwards. There was another question. Could you explain what constitutes clinical research?
Yeah, my understanding of clinical research specifically would be, I guess, research that you're doing with patients. So, for example, any sort of work with like clinical trials or any other work that has to do with like treatment of patients, that would be clinical research to my understanding. Does that match your understanding, Ria? Anything?
Yeah, 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 I don't know if I have more to add to that.
Yeah, and there's also different types of research that aren't clinical, like wet lab research wouldn't be considered clinical, like any other sort of like biomedical research that's not in the patient stage yet is not clinical. So any sort of like animal models and all those things, um, but they can still be considered medical research. And there's also things that might be more population based, like surveys and that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of different types of research, and some are more interesting to certain people than others. And again, I don't think that you should necessarily feel that you have to um, do a specific type of research. I personally think it's helpful to do some types, but I think that research as a term can be used loosely, and you want to be able to show that you've thought about how to use the scientific method and how to plan projects and how to think through hypotheses, but that doesn't need to be clinical research or wet lab research. It can also be a literature research or population-based research or community-based projects. those can all show the skills that it is that they want you to have.
Yeah, the research experiences I had before medical school were mostly in public health, and population health, which is something I'm now diverging from. So things and your interests will change. Um, but yeah, there's lots of different types of research experiences. And another question that I received privately that I think would be helpful for everyone to hear is, did interviewers ask you why you're not going into social justice stuff as a career instead of medicine? Fatuma, did you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people being asked that. I was personally never asked that. I did kind of like think about how I would answer if I was. I think personally, in the way that I presented myself in interviews, I was very clear that, you know, I wanted to be a physician to help eliminate disparities in health, like working with patients one-on-one, and also being able to do research on health disparities. And I think that being a physician allowed me to do both of those things. And so other like things to think about is like, it's good to think about like, why do you want to be a doctor specifically? Why do you want to be a doctor instead of being a nurse or a social worker or a community organizer? And I think if you have the answers to those questions, then you should be fine. Yeah, I personally don't think that's like a great question to ask, and I'm glad that I didn't have that, because I think I don't necessarily like think that's like the most appropriate question, but it is good to reflect onto why it is that you feel like you want to be a doctor versus other career paths that might also get to similar places. So what makes being a doctor different than those things for you? And think about that.
Yeah, I remember receiving feedback on my personal statement that was like an encouragement to articulate about why medicine more specifically, because I think the way that in that draft of my personal statement was more focusing on social justice. And so I thought that was helpful feedback, because med schools are going to want you to very specifically articulate why medicine. Um, but the assumptions behind that question of medicine not being something that's inherently about social justice are wrong. So if you're asked that, that's the other person's problem. But if you're in an environment where you have to answer it, making that connection of like how that's connected for you. And yeah, that's, I also agree that it's a bad question.
Yeah, and you verbalized it exactly. What I was going to say is, yes, medicine and social justice are completely intertwined if that's the type of doctor that you want to be. And that's why I said I feel like that it's an inappropriate question to ask. But everything that Ria said, I completely agree with. You do have to be able to say and explain why medicine versus anything else. But like I said, you can go into medicine as a form of social justice, and that is totally valid. So we are going to just go into the last section today because we're running short on time. I just want to talk a little bit about extracurriculars and COVID. I think for some of you who maybe aren't right at the, you're not applying yet, it might be a little bit stressful to think about how you're going to have new activities during COVID times, because there's so many things that are no longer available, especially things like volunteering and in-person things. So I wanted to give you guys just some ideas. Volunteering, tough. It's really tough now. There's a lot less volunteering opportunities, even as a med student. Some things to think about: COVID testing and vaccination sites. I would definitely like look into that. Personally, I know that there's like a lot of unhoused population outreach going on, like in the Berkeley area with like Suitcase and things like that, that we have at the Joint Medical Program. So I would look into what sort of population outreach. It can be unhoused population outreach. It can be any communities that you're interested in. If there are if there are opportunities available, I would look into it. That being said, I think probably COVID testing and vaccination sites are going to be the things that are most common now. A lot of like community clinics and things like that have been like closed or doing more what's it called, telehealth visits. So those are going to be limited. And so thinking about other ways you can do volunteering and in-person stuff, I think that that's going to be limited generally, but those are some ideas. So research, we talked about this a little bit today. I think this is a great time to engage in remote research, and perhaps there's going to be more opportunities for remote research than there was before. So you can feel free to reach out to professors or people that you're interested in. And again, because it's going to be so many things are remote now, you can widen your network and perhaps, contact people who are not in your institution or at a different school, etc. That being said, when you're just reaching out to people, a lot of them won't respond to you, but that's okay. You just have to, keep working and seeing what's out there. When I was in college, I used lots of like the job boards within my college to look for research experiences, and I think that's a great place to start. But also, if you feel like you can articulate why you're interested in some person's research, cold emailing them is also totally okay. And it might land you with a research position with them. If you want to do your own literature analysis or survey or anything like that, you can totally conduct your own research, and that's okay. So something I think would be really helpful again is why I wanted to have our public health librarian come speak, because if there is a question you want answered, you could do a literature analysis and go through the literature and, kind of conduct your own research project. And when I was in college, I took a course where that was the entire course, was just to ask a question and do a literature search to answer my question. And, then from there, that was something that I did put on one of my most meaningful things, because I wrote like a 30-page paper on a certain question, and that's also completely valid as research. Again, like surveys and things like that, use the tools you have available to you to do research. And then to kind of legitimize your research, I would definitely try to look for places where you can present it. So any sort of student conferences, I would look first within your institution and then within your surrounding areas. So if you're doing public health research that you did yourself, you can look for, undergrad public health conference, and just do Google searches and try to present things where you can. I think that adds a little bit more legitimacy if you're doing your own self-led research. Again, get creative. You can start a blog, you can start a podcast, you can start some sort of informative social media account, you can create infographics and do your own research project. So there's so many things. All those things are important, and all those things can help improve, health, if that's what you're interested in, or provide information. So I would invite you to get creative. And activism and community engagement, which kind of I think also ties into volunteering sometimes. I think that it is tough in the moment, but there are so many underserved communities, and I think there's so many ways to help. Think about what communities are important to you, what communities you're part of, and what are their needs, and how can you organize, even in a small way, to help those communities. So I think I'll end there, and we're already at time, so we can just stay on for questions.
Yeah, I have a question. So, I mean, this might be a little bit silly, but I just noticed that with you, Fatima, and also just kind of other people I've talked to, y'all like show a lot of initiative by like co-founding or founding something. And I guess one of my concerns with my activities is that I haven't necessarily like founded or co-founded anything, but I have taken a lot of initiative to make changes that I wanted to see to pre-existing organizations. Yeah, and I guess, or I've also like joined some like new organizations, and help kind of support them and like provide my input on like what, our goals should be and what we want to achieve. So I don't know. I guess I was just wondering, is that still something that like is strong, and would it be weighed less than like co-founding something or not?
No, I don't think so. I think as long as you're able to explain and verbalize what changes you've made to existing organizations, I think that that's great. There's no expectation that you need to found anything at all. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, I was late, but I have a question. Like, I don't even know what UCSF-UCB White Coats for Black Lives is. Like, is this an organization within Berkeley? Are you like a student org? Or are you all medical? You're all like medical students, so I don't know. Like, I'm just confused what this is. I just like found a link to the meeting. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a medical student organization. And yep, we're all med students, and a lot of what we spend our organizational time doing is providing resources, seminars for underrepresented pre-med students, and helping them along the admissions path.
Okay, thank you so much.
I have another question really quickly. So, this is an organization that I've been a part of like in college. However, like we are trying to spread to other schools. And I was just wondering, I do understand that the activities section should be primarily focused on things we have done rather than like what we plan to do. But would it also be okay to maybe, so for this organization, like ideally, when I do get accepted into medical school, I would also want to like kind of start a chapter at whatever school I end up attending. So would that be okay to like maybe mention briefly in the activities section?
Yeah, or sorry, Ria, you can go ahead.
I think you want to talk about um, what you've already done, and there could be other ways for you to share. Like in a secondary, I think that would be a good place to be like, this is how I want to connect the work I'm already doing to what I want to do in medical school. Um, and that can be specific to the schools you're applying to as well.
Thank you.
I have one more question. So I feel like a lot of other schools like Davis and UCLA and like other schools that have medical schools within them have more pipeline programs. Does UC Berkeley have any to help get into medical school, or is it more just like organizations like this that help with mentoring and resources?
So there's I went to Berkeley as an undergrad, and there's a program called Undergraduate Research Internship, which is not like which is a program for UIM students, and that can be one way. I'm trying to see if I can find the link. They didn't end up having a cohort last year because of COVID, but that was like a transformative program for me and like a big reason for why I can be here. So I'll put the name in the chat, but I can't find
I
the
think
link.
I know what you're talking about. It was Yuri, right?
Yeah, Yuri.
Also, sorry, before people leave, if you guys could answer the poll, it's really 5 short questions, and it's really important that we get your guys' feedback. So it'll take you less than a minute. And if you could please fill that out before you leave, we would really, really appreciate it.
Are there other like pipeline programs or that you know of, Fatuma?
I didn't go to a UC, so I'm not super familiar with any pipeline programs for UC students. Yeah, I mean, I know like at Cal, it seems like there's lots of like undergrad organizations like Minorities in Health, and the Black Health Student Association. So I think those are but they're not necessarily pipeline programs. I think that they more provide resources. So that's not something I know that much about.
There's also, this is more of a community space, but biology scholars program. And that has some access to resources and support as well. Did you mention that already? And I didn't remember.
Yeah, maybe we could take one more question if there's any more left. And thank you guys so much for filling out the polls. We really appreciate it.
I was wondering whether you included a hobby into your activity section.
I didn't, but I think that it's definitely something you could talk about. And if you also don't end up talking about a hobby in your activity section, everyone has always told me to make sure that I talk about hobbies in interviews and stuff, which the explanation I think is a little silly, but is fair. I think it's good to show that you're a well-rounded person. And I think a lot of times with pre-meds, people feel like it's all just, everyone kind of does medicine things, and sometimes the worry is that they can be less well-rounded. So I think talking about hobbies, wherever it is that you feel like it's important to talk about them, is going to be helpful, either in your interviews or on your application or both.
Thank you.